Okay, that got a little bit dark. Hello everyone, my name is Tara East and I'm a lecturer in creative writing and the author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. In today's video, I want to share some tips and advice on how to create conflict in your story. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to frame this discussion around 4 key points: internal conflict, external conflict, contrast, and consequences. I spoke about some of these points in my last video, but I feel there's room to unpack these points further and to provide some additional examples. Now let's start with internal conflict, and I'm going to provide a bit of an explanation first before I get into some examples. So internal conflict refers to the struggle your protagonist has within themselves. The internal conflict can appear in a variety of forms. So it might look like trauma, triggers, psychological, intellectual, or emotional struggles. It could be as simple as a lack of self-belief or a lack of confidence, or it could be as complex as a psychological wound. Internal conflict, of course, is not just limited to your protagonist. We also need to consider our side characters and our antagonists. Remember, every character in your book should feel like a full, whole, and complex person within themselves. Your side characters should have their own desires and motivations. Even if they have a positive relationship to your protagonist, it is perfectly fine if they are sometimes in opposition to the protagonist, because this is going to create additional conflict within your story. And if you're writing a book that contains an antagonist, then the internal conflict you look at could extend to psychological conditions, including personality disorders such as psychopathy or sociopathy, especially if you're writing a crime or thriller. Okay, that got a little bit dark. How about we look at some examples? Now, of course, in all of my examples, I'm absolutely going to be talking about spoilers. So if you don't want to learn anything about these books or TV shows, if you haven't seen or read them, then just skip ahead to the rest of the video. Now, I'm going to use The Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo as a bit of a case study here for internal conflict. So Six of Crows, or Shadow and Bones if you're more familiar with the TV show rather than the books, has some really good examples of internal conflict. So let's look at the character Kaz Brecker. Kaz's internal conflict stems from his childhood trauma when he and his older brother Geordie were duped by a con man and lost all of their money. Penniless, the young boys were cast from the boarding house where they were staying, and they are now living on the streets. Unfortunately, a plague is sweeping through the city, and both boys quickly become ill. Assumed to be dead, the boys are removed from the city and dumped onto a sick boat that is then cast out to the sea. Kaz wakes and then uses his brother's dead body, his corpse, to float back to the city. The traumatic experience of waking on the sick boat, of realizing that his brother is dead, and then having to use his brother's body as a flotation device have obviously caused Kaz a lot of severe trauma. Many years later, as a young adult, he cannot tolerate physically touching another person's skin, so he wears gloves and he only ever takes them off in private. Now, there are 2 clear points of conflict that are stemming from this horrific moment in Kaz's past. The most significant source of conflict is Kaz's need for revenge. He wants to take down the con man who fooled him and his brother. This need for revenge is what motivates Kaz to become a gangster, and one with a very menacing reputation. I mentioned before Kaz's inability to tolerate physical contact, and this is our second source of internal conflict, and it connects to the novel's romantic subplot. So Inej is a member of Kaz's gang, and Kaz has a big old crush on her. There's no point in him pursuing any kind of relationship with Inej because of Kaz's really intense PTSD. Now, because Inej is a very good side character, she has her own internal struggles, including some less than pleasant memories that she has after working at a pleasure house before Kaz paid off her indenture. Needless to say, a romantic relationship isn't exactly easy for Inej either. Now let's look at external sources of conflict, and for this I'm going to be referring to Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. So external conflict obviously is referring to obstacles and challenges that are outside of your character's control. The interesting thing about external conflict is that it can play out on the macro and the micro level. A macro external conflict are things like politics, social, cultural, religious, or educational institutions, systems, or influences. So, for examples, in Lessons in Chemistry, Elizabeth wants desperately to be a scientist, specifically a chemist. Unfortunately, it's the 1960s, so she kind of picked the wrong decade for this career. Throughout the book and the TV show adaptation, we see how Elizabeth's desire is in opposition to the social attitudes of the time, attitudes that greatly impact both industry and educational institutions. So, for example, Elizabeth is one of the best students in her class. She goes on to enroll in a PhD, but unfortunately she cannot complete her dissertation because she, rightfully, leaves after being sexually harassed by her supervisor. She eventually gets a job as a lab assistant, but given her ambition and intellectual abilities, this is far from fulfilling. The external stakes increase again when her partner is killed in a car accident and Elizabeth realizes that she is pregnant. Through a series of events, Elizabeth ends up becoming the host of a cooking show. When Elizabeth starts folding her knowledge of chemistry into her cooking instructions, the network producer is unimpressed. He wants a host that behaves like a pretty, bubbly housewife. Now, in all of that summary, I've covered a number of macro and micro external conflicts, but let's pause here to sort of differentiate these. So the macro external conflicts in Lessons in Chemistry stem from the misogynistic attitudes of the 1960s. These impacted the way that people in positions of power viewed women in general, and in relation to our protagonist, this greatly limits Elizabeth's opportunities to become a chemist. The micro-external conflicts are the challenges that Elizabeth encounters at university and in the workplace and even in her own home. So this looks like supervisors, bosses, and co-workers underestimating her or taking advantage of her, including stealing her theories and then using them without acknowledgement or attribution. It also includes the loss of her partner and the discovery of an unexpected and very unwanted pregnancy. I'm using the terms macro and micro here to speak about these types of conflicts, but you might find it easier to think about these as public and private conflicts. If you're writing a dystopian novel, for example, and let's say you have a servant who's the main protagonist, the public sources of conflict could be an oppressive government, and the private sources of conflict could be a cruel homeowner. The servant is going to be in a lot more direct interaction with their cruel boss, but how they literally move through the world might be dictated by the oppressive government. Now let's look at contrast and contradiction. So rather than unpacking one particular story in terms of contrast and contradiction, I'll speak to a number of novels who approach this in a variety of ways. Contrast can appear in your novel as contrasting characters, or characters who are in contrast to the world. You might like to think of them as outsiders. In children's literature, particularly books aimed at very young readers, we often have two characters that are in stark contrast to one another. This makes it a lot easier to differentiate the characters beyond physical appearance, and it introduces conflict into the narrative. Now, these same principles can just as easily be applied to adult fiction. Now let's take a look at Outlander by Gabaldon. This book begins with our main character Claire, a woman who is visiting Inverness, Scotland during 1945. She touches a stone and is transported back to the 18th century. Because Claire is from the 20th century, her values and beliefs are largely in contrast to everyone around her as well as broader society. It is these values and beliefs that are the catalyst for many of the dramas that propel the plot forward. But what about contrasting characters? In John Green's Turtles All the Way Down, best friends Ava and Daisy couldn't be more different. Ava is a young girl with obsessive-compulsive disorder. She is more introverted, often gets caught up in her own thoughts, and she moves through the world with a great deal of care and caution. Daisy, her best friend, is highly extroverted, friendly, and spontaneous. Throughout the book, the contrasting personality of these two friends creates a gentle tension, but this then builds until the novel's climax, where the two have a massive fight and then a falling out. Now, what about Richard from The Secret History by Donna Tart? Richard is from a working class background, and when he is accepted by the prestigious Hampton College, he finds himself enamored with a particular group of students who are studying the Greek classics. His classmates are highly educated and come from wildly wealthy families. Richard's father, by contrast, ran a gas station, and his mum stayed at home until she eventually got a job answering phones at a chip factory. To feel less like an outsider, Richard fabricates a more palatable childhood, one where his parents are in show business. Richard's true identity is in contrast with those around him, so he fabricates this false identity, one that he thinks will be more pleasing, particularly at the beginning. Now, I'm sharing this example so that you can see how additional conflict and tension can be created when a character is trying to hide an aspect of themselves or their identity from others. Just as an aside, if you are really interested in the idea of contrasting characters, then I highly recommend watching True Detective, as each season features two detectives who have very opposing values, personalities, and motives. You can also usually find this type of dynamic in romances or romantic comedies because these types of stories are very character-driven, and so much of the tension is created through a clash in personalities, opinions, or values. This particular quality is really easy to see in all of Emily Henry's novels, so they can be a good study too. I just realized that I have pretty much all of the books I've mentioned so far on the desk next to me, and I've held up almost none of them. But now we're going to talk about Contradiction, and I'd like to speak specifically about Yellowface by Rebecca F. Kuang. Yellowface is about a young writer, June, who steals the unpublished manuscript of her famous dead friend, Athena. And I say friend with air quotes. At the beginning of the novel, June is impressed by the quality of the manuscript that she has stolen. The writing may not be perfect, but it is clear that this is a work of high literary merit, and had it been published while Athena was still alive, it would have been career-changing. As June is reading the manuscript, she literally thinks to herself, "It's better than anything I could write, perhaps in this lifetime." June then starts editing the manuscript, and eventually she decides to claim it as her own. She sends it to her agent, it gets published, and it becomes wildly successful. June's thought process then starts to contradict itself. Now that the book is successful, she thinks of it less as Athena's book and more as a book that she co-wrote with Athena. When accusations start to arise that June may not be the real author of this book, June's thinking changes again. Now, sitting in her apartment, shut off from the world and doom-scrolling on her phone, she thinks about how poorly the book was really written, how much additional research she had to do, how she had gone through the manuscript sentence by sentence, revising and rewriting so many times that although Athena may have produced this scrappy first draft, the book wouldn't be what it is now without June's hard work. June's rising defensiveness and her contradictory thinking are some of the major sources of conflict in the book, as it directly shapes her decision-making and the actions that she takes. Now I'd like to speak about consequences. One of the main ways you can build tension in your novel is to have your characters make decisions and then they have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Now, the examples I've provided so far are from wildly successful bestsellers, many of which have been adapted to film. But right now, I want to lightly talk about Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruocchio. This book came out in 2018, but because a couple of people with really big platforms on YouTube reviewed it during 2023, the book has now become incredibly popular among sci-fi fans. Now, I won't get into any spoilers for this one, but this is a great one to study if you are interested in examining how a plot can be made from character decisions. When I think about this book in terms of plot, I imagine the protagonist, Hadrian, laying down bricks as he moves forward in the world. The vast majority of obstacles and challenges he has to deal with are created because of past decisions that he has made, both calculated and spontaneous. Obviously, we want our characters to have agency and to make decisions, but we don't always want them to be good decisions. It's actually a lot more interesting if your characters make bad decisions. Now, the final example I'm going to unpack today is How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. Now, I think it's safe to say that most horror novels are created out of the bad decisions that the characters make, and this novel is no exception. Do not go into that basement. If you haven't read this book and you would like to, maybe just skip this entire section, because I'm about to give away some major spoilers. Now, the two main characters in this book are Louise and Mark. These estranged siblings are brought back together after the unexpected death of their parents. The details of dealing with their parents' estate are complicated, so for the sake of this video, let's just say that the brother and sister have to deal with their childhood home and the assets within it together. Their mother loved to make dolls and puppets, and while Louise has always found them to be a little unsettling, they've also always just been a part of her home. As Louise starts to clear out the house, she frequently rationalizes away strange occurrences, such as a TV that frequently switches on by itself, puppets that change locations, and a drop-down attic stairwell that has been weirdly boarded up. Things become increasingly strange at the house, and when the opportunity to leave arises, Louise decides to stay for no other reason than to spite her brother. When she is eventually attacked by a puppet, she again rationalizes it by convincing herself that she's actually going through a psychotic break and that the house isn't good for her mental health. She and her brother enter the home again, and let's just say things do not go well. Louise, still alive, thinks that she has solved the issue of the possessed puppet, only to discover that she has underestimated the puppet's ability. Because of the past decisions she has made, though, the option of leaving no longer exists. She has to deal with this situation, otherwise her very young daughter is going to get very hurt. As the novel progresses and the mystery of the possessed puppet is eventually revealed, we learn that all of this terror is the result of a bad decision Louise's grandparents made many, many years ago. In essence, the entire source of conflict in this story has come about because of one character's decision, and then we get to see all of the other decisions other characters have to make in order to resolve this problem. Now, there are many ways we can create tension in a novel, and I've just covered 4 of the biggest ones in this video. So internal conflict, external conflict, contrast and contradiction, as well as consequences. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Can you think of any novels, TV shows, or movies that are great examples of these types of conflicts? What do you think about the ideas and examples that I shared today? And do any of these approaches mirror the way that you write? I'd love to know, so please leave a comment below. If you'd like even more writing advice, you can of course check out the other videos on this channel, or you can go to tareast.com and dive into the archives. While you're there, feel free to join up to my email newsletter. When you do, you'll receive newsletters from me that contain a note, a quote of the week, some resources I've recently loved and think you will too, as well as some other tidbits that I only share via email. Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Now go do some writing, because the world really does need more books.